Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Wipond. I'm a journalist, freelance journalist, and have been for a long time. I got interested in the issue of forced treatment really 25 some years ago when it happened to my father. And I was really kind of aghast at how poorly my father was treated in the situation, and really also just how remarkably quick he went from career college professor of computer engineering to certified mental patient being treated against his will. And yeah, it was just kind of humiliating for him and really difficult for the whole family. And we kind of polarized around how we felt about what was happening. And so I ended up immediately kind of wondering too, after witnessing all this, gee, who else is this happening to? Because my father had all the supports you might want to have in such a situation, a caring family, enough money in the bank to take care of himself and all those sorts of things. A lot of, he could take recovery time. He'd recently retired. So all those kind of benefits, and still it was just a terrible experience for him. And really, in many ways, I just feel like he recovered from that, that in some ways the treatment was worse than what he'd been going through to begin with. So, yeah, I wondered who else is this happening to and what's happening to them immediately, and started to investigate that and writing about it and becoming involved with Mad in America, the website, web magazine there, and sort of outside of Canada where I'm from. I started there, and then I started researching in America and discovering, oh, it's almost exactly the same. Many of the features are the same in both countries. And yeah, so I've continued. I wrote this book, and I'm going to do a presentation now. I don't know how many of you have seen me before, but just so you know, this is kind of my basic introduction, as it were, a sort of overview of some of the key themes and issues in the book. And I've added some new stuff with new developments going on lately around some of the issues that I address. But by and large, I kind of do it as an introduction to these issues, looking at the laws and the processes and whatnot. And then hopefully, we'll have lots of time for discussion. We've got 2 hours set. Maybe we'll take a little break, as Earl suggested, after the presentation. So my presentation will be about 40 minutes to an hour. And yeah, and if there's those of you who haven't seen it, if you want to duck out and come back for a bit, I won't be offended at all, because you might be getting a bit tired of some of these slides that you've seen already. But yeah, so I've got a slideshow and I want to show some of it. It just makes it easier because I know some of us are more visual than auditory, and what usually I'm kind of essentially reiterating what's on the slides, so you don't have to actually look at them if you don't want to in most cases. Yeah, so that's it. And I'm going to try a headset today, because I often find when I do this, I get so animated, I get so so excited and aggravated about what I'm talking about, that I feel like I'm yelling the whole time. And I kind of want to try to do this in a calmer way today. So that's my little experiment that you'll be sharing with me. See if I can do it, and if having a headset helps me remain a little bit more measured in how I present this. So I am going to share my screen now. Where are we here? Okay. And all right. Okay, we good to go? Is that looking all right? Thank you. Okay, so that's the name of my book, Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. And yeah, it's available pretty well everywhere you can buy books. And the references for this talk, I don't try to squeeze them into all these slides in most cases. So if you are interested in the references, just get in touch with me at that email address or through my website. There's a complete PDF of a lot of the references from the book, most of which are what are in this talk today. All right, so I want to talk first about this dominant public story that's out there. Even people who know nothing else about the mental health system have usually heard this story. And that's that back in the 1950s, we had these large asylums, 330 beds per 100,000 people, and that there's been a massive reduction with the closure of those asylums down to 11 beds per 100,000 people. Alongside that, there have been these tightening laws that are much more rights protecting of individuals, that make commitment nearly impossible for even the most dangerous people, and that this thing that's often called a deinstitutionalization process, this has caused actually many people with labeled with mental illnesses to be imprisoned or homeless in the streets. And, and along with that, then, although forced interventions and involuntary commitment are very rare today compared to the 1950s, they treat illness or reduce violence, and patients are usually grateful. So this is kind of the general narrative that's out there in most mainstream media. And in fact, it's all wrong. And I'll kind of show you, here's all the media you can find it in. And I like to highlight this. These are just, a sampling that I kind of pulled when I was researching the book. And you can see that it's left, right, center, sensationalist, investigative, pretty well every kind of mainstream media out there, and non-mainstream too, alternative news media, really tell this kind of same story. It's become quite dominant. And there's a reason for that I explore in the book. And that's that Treatment Advocacy Center has been a very influential lobby organization. And it's not like they really have, that they're so powerful, but it's that there are so few lobby organizations working in this area of involuntary commitment. They're really the only one that has funding specifically to lobby, and they've been extremely successful with their PR initiatives with media and with legislators really across the country. They have defined how America, and indeed to some degree Canada as well, understand what involuntary commitment is. And so, yeah, the story is all wrong. So I'm going to walk through each piece of that story now and kind of deconstruct what the reality is. And it's really not that hard to find some of this information. It's not really hidden. And so we can talk about why is it that this narrative has been so compelling that hardly anyone ever bothers to even actually fact check it at all. So commonly forced interventions involve any or all of these things, and that's a police apprehension, a locked or semi-locked institution with security guards, threats and pressure to comply, either just behavior compliance or with treatments that may be being offered. Your belongings will be taken away from you. Many jurisdictions allow forced stripping. There's common use of restraints and seclusion in these settings. Tranquilizing drugs are administered. Technically, you're usually supposed to be allowed a hearing first before you're forcibly drugged, but there's wide discretion within the laws under emergency provisions. And it's very undefined what an emotional emergency even is. So they can basically forcibly treat pretty much anyone they want to, and often do. And if you refuse them, then you'll be injected with these. And it's usually a concoction of tranquilizing and sedating drugs used in emergency settings. And also, I'll note, for long-term forced psychiatric drugging, it's usually tranquilizing drugs, antipsychotic medications that are used in that kind of context. Electroconvulsive shock therapy is still in most states allowed as a form of forced treatment. And now, we're going to talk about this later, coercive home visitation, long-term antipsychotic injections are much more commonly used. So this is forced treatment happening outside of institutional settings. And I'm going to show in the data that this is actually looks to be the future of forced treatment outside of institutions. So, how do people sort of experience these interventions? Well, in the research, and there's very little of it, I have to emphasize, and when I say little, like maybe a dozen studies ever internationally that have been done on the effectiveness of this. There's more that kind of look at sort of the overall effects, interview people who've been through it. But if we're really trying to understand what's happening, there's very few studies of this, and researchers that walked before me have lamented that, and I lamented it as well. Like, this is a really common intervention, and it's so understudied. But the research does show that this experience of perceived coercion is key. So for example, I can lock you up, but say to you, hey, I'm really sorry I have to do this. Have you ever tried medications before? Would you like to try them? And it can be a really mutually respectful process. And, you can have a lot of input and say, potentially, and that does happen. I don't want to say it never happens. And when it does, it's usually not as bad as experience for a person because they feel feel, so they're nominally involuntary. So on the books, they're technically being held involuntarily, but they're not really, because they're being treated respectfully. And so those people may occasionally be grateful for the experience. And so there was one US study of this that found, without patient commitment, found that 28% of the people after a year of it were somewhat thankful for the overall experience. 72% were not. And so the key thing here is, if you perceived that you were really being coerced, if you were being treated against your will, that's when people's gratefulness plummets, and plummets dramatically. And that's consistent across the research. And so more often what we hear with patients who've truly been coerced, who've experienced forced treatment in the true sense of how we mean it, they're more often say things like, this was a humiliating experience. It was traumatizing, terrifying, brutal. They referred to the drugs as feeling like they were being put in a chemical straitjacket. They make comparisons often to physical and sexual assault. And I have to emphasize that this is even people who've personally experienced physical assault or sexual assault in childhood will often say their experience of forced treatment at a psychiatric hospital was as bad or even worse than their experience of sexual assault as a child. So this is really important, because this is not an uncommon statement at all. And it's really suppressed in our culture. When we see news articles about forced treatment, even ones that are relatively critical, we won't see this raised up. That yes, many people compare it to sexual assault in childhood. And it's just a dramatic thing that needs to be more talked about publicly. And along with that, some of the best evidence we have for the longer term effects are that suicides after psychiatric hospitalization, and that's involuntary or voluntary, they aren't usually separated in these studies. Suicides increase dramatically after these experiences. So that's, we can't prove what's causing that, but obviously it's really damning information, really concerning information about what's going on in psychiatric hospitals. So now I want to talk about this deinstitutionalization theme. So actually, every study that's ever looked at what actually happened to deinstitutionalized patients when the asylums closed, the studies that actually tracked these patients found, we have 23 studies were done in 12 Western nations, several in the United States and Canada, and they found that tracked their later housing or imprisonment status, found that less than 2% of in all cases had ever experienced any homelessness or imprisonment. In the majority of studies, no single case of homelessness or imprisonment was reported at all. So that's really what's going on. So you'd say, how did we get this narrative out there that somehow the unhoused and people in prison are, all mostly mentally ill? Well, that's merely happened because people have sort of speculated and theorized about it. And I'm going to look at some of the data we do have on this. But generally what's happened is they just said, well, we closed asylums and homelessness increased, so there must be a correlation. And they didn't actually look at the data. The data actually says, no, there isn't a correlation at all. Something else is causing rampant hopelessness, and it wasn't closure of asylums. So where are these people? Then you say, we did close the asylums. That actually did happen. So where are all the other beds? So first I want to talk about, in the 1950s, asylums held many different kinds of patients, not only psychiatric patients, but elderly people with dementia, people with brain injuries, people with intellectual disabilities. They were really sort of these, locations where a hodgepodge of the population was kind of thrown. But if we look specifically at how many people there, by today's standards, were labeled with mental illnesses and were there because of their mental illness, it was about 190 beds per 100,000 people back in the 1950s. So, okay, that's the real number of how many were back then. How many do we have today? Well, it's important to know that mental health funding has actually increased per capita a lot, 30 times since the 1950s. Now, this is a rough sort of back of the serviette kind of calculation I came up with. Please don't hold it to me. But roughly speaking, we have really good data since about the 80s or 90s, and it tracks. I just tried to go back a little bit further. So basically, mental health funding per person across the country has gone up dramatically. And where's all that money gone? Well, first of all, there are inpatient psychiatric beds now in state, county, private and general hospitals, residential treatment centers, nursing homes, Veterans Administration, Department of Defense, all these places have specialized psychiatric beds. And when you add those up, this is a study done not by me, but by the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, they landed on the number of 124 beds per 100,000 people. So a slight drop from the 1950s, but nowhere near the kind of catastrophic 95% drop that people typically talk about. But that's not all the beds. So then we have to add up the 24/7 psychiatric beds that are in assisted living and supportive housing and group homes. This was exactly what the closure of asylums was supposed to be transitioning into. These kinds of smaller community-based facilities are what got funded as they closed those large hospitals. And so here were some numbers I managed to cobble together. You'll see at the low end, Connecticut and New Jersey, 29, 39, but where the counts were a bit more comprehensive. In California, 140 beds per 100,000 people, New York, 246. So just that group alone is more psychiatric beds than existed in the 1950s alone. And then we have to add back in all of these other general hospital beds, and we're not done yet. So then we have to add in emergency rooms because they're not pleasant places, but they're commonly used to hold people, sometimes for prolonged periods, who are labeled with psychiatric illnesses. And that's the one number I found was 1.7 million people a year. And then there's prisons. They actually have specialized psychiatric units, some of them. There's foster care in the troubled teen industry for children because children used to be in those large asylums. So we have to add in those beds. There's many, many more. And so when I kind of roughed in these numbers, I landed at, in some states where I could get fairly comprehensive numbers, that they had double or triple the per capita beds that existed in the 1950s. So that's really what's happening today. We have far more people than ever before labeled with mental illnesses and being treated for mental illnesses. And in many of these institutions, potentially flat out against their will or just very coercively, because even an average group home, even though you may not be able to be legally forcibly treated there, you're being monitored all the time. So it can be a very coercive setting. Now, along with this, what we have is this expansion of what qualifies as a mental disorder. And this is completely distorting the public dialogue around all these issues. And this is important to know because the step one legal criterion for being committed is that the person has a substantial disorder of the mind or a mental disorder. This is how they define this, sort of varies from state to state. And essentially the legal definition and the psychiatric medical definition are not necessarily exactly the same in law, but they kind of overlap a lot in how they actually are treated in a legal setting. So essentially having a mental disorder is the step one legal criteria. If you have a mental disorder, now you could potentially be subjected to mental health laws. And this is relevant because you'll see here, as of 2023, 50% of children will have had a clinical mental disorder before the age of 18, according to the National Institute of Mental Health. We have really broadened how we define what a mental disorder is. And a recent study in JAMA Network Open in another country, but still, you know, it's large. These are largely comparable to how some studies have found the numbers in North America as well. They found that 85% of adults will have had 2 or more mental disorders before the age of 45. So again, we just have these very amorphous definitions of what mental disorder even means, such that really all of us at some point of our lives are likely going to meet the clinical definition and the legal definition for involuntary commitment, the step one in the process. So now let's look at step two. So in fact, contrary to common belief, commitment criteria have expanded for decades everywhere across the country. There's really no exceptions here. So generally, though, trying to sum up what we're seeing going on out there, there's an emergency evaluation period that can last for days or weeks, where you're just being held to see if you might meet some of these criteria. Then in the formal situation where you're actually attending a hearing and you're battling out your rights, these are the criteria that come into play. The ones most people know: the risk of danger or harm to yourself or to others is the most common one. Some states have that you might be putting property at risk in some way. That can be a criterion for locking you up and forcibly treating you. But we've expanded far beyond that into this risk of the inability to meet your own needs, what's called the grave disability standard in many states. So that sense that you might not be able to take care of your own housing or clothing, you're not behaving in a way that worries other people about your potential for survival. So that can make you subjected to involuntary commitment. And then there's an even broader one that's being more widely used all the time now, and that's the risk of mental or physical deterioration. And this is almost like an Orwellian definition, where it essentially says if there is a risk that you might deteriorate in such a way, mentally or physically, in future, you might deteriorate, and in future meet the criteria for commitment, then you can be committed now and forcibly treated now. And more states have this on the book. And all this really does, it gives psychiatrists and judges enormous leeway. So all of us have stories, and that's what I found. You might have a story. There are lots of stories out there of someone who, you or I might think, well, that person was clearly dangerous and should have been locked up and never was. And then you can also find examples of that person should never have been locked up and they were. And yes, we can find anecdotal examples of all of this because these criteria are so broad and amorphous that it really depends on the individual perspectives of individual psychiatrists and judges and institutions, how this really plays out in practice. But I'm going to show you in a moment what's actually been happening. But I want to stop momentarily here and talk briefly about this very common concept that's out there, that the only reason people would refuse these treatments or refuse commitment is because you lack insight and you're unaware that you're ill. So it's such it's a difficult argument to even fight against, because it could apply to anyone, right? Because clearly, even if you are in fact totally sane, if you say that and someone else is labeling you as ill, well, now you qualify. You apparently lack insight. So how do we distinguish between a sane person who's saying, I don't believe I should be committed, versus a quote unquote insane person who's saying that? You can't distinguish. This is just a meaningless phrase. It has no substance in law. It has no substance in science at all. And so it's consequently actually hard to argue against. It's really just a form of prejudice. It's to say, well, I just think you're crazy. And if you don't see that, you're even more crazy. That's all. It's just a form of prejudice manifest in some way that has unfortunately become a really dominant way of viewing people who get labeled with mental illnesses. And so I just want to ask that question: is refusing drugs, and maybe potentially at the same time having some kind of wacky beliefs that other people don't share with you, or beliefs that aren't, that are easily provable to be wrong, are those two things together enough, in your opinion, to commit someone? Because if they are, who doesn't meet that criteria? Who do you know who doesn't have a wacky belief that you might not agree with, and at the same time would not like to be forcibly treated or locked up indefinitely? Because again, I submit to you, that's everyone. It certainly includes me. I'm part of this group. And then I want to highlight, what do people truly say? What people truly say about why they refuse drugs. Every survey of this, why they refuse treatments, every survey of this has found the same things. They actually usually have a pretty good reason why. And that they find the treatments are ineffective, they find them unhelpful, they find the adverse effects of the treatments too severe, they are preferring some sort of non-drug therapeutic option or support, and they may just disagree with this label that's been given. They say, well, yeah, okay, sure, I can see that I have a belief that you don't have, but that doesn't mean I necessarily, quote unquote, have schizophrenia. It doesn't mean I have a brain disease. And so they may feel instead that they have a difference that's rooted in conflict socially, or they have a spiritual or philosophical difference rooted in some sort of experience they've had. They may feel that that the causes of their struggles are rooted in trauma or abuse in some way, and they want to talk about that instead of simply being labeled in some way. So these are the real reasons that people typically refuse. And so we should never divert to this very prejudicial way of saying, oh, they only refuse because they're crazy. No, in most cases, people have pretty good reasons for why they're refusing, and the same reasons that any quote unquote sane person would have as well. So now what's really going on out there, and this is the bulk of where we really get into my book and what I'm exploring in the book, is now it's really hard to get this data. Governments are not tracking it, they're hiding a lot. But where we can find the data, civil psychiatric detentions across America are increasing. They've been increasing for decades and quite dramatically. So outside of those data black holes, we found that in many states, the rates of forced the only data we really have is on commitments, on detentions, on the sort of forced attempt. We don't really know how many people are actually being forcibly medicated. So these are all about emergency interventions, detentions, people being locked up for certain periods of time. So in many states, these numbers have doubled in 5 to 10 years. In 22 states where researchers from UCLA could find data, in this 5-year period, the per capita rate of detentions increased 3 times faster than population growth. And that was about an estimated 1 million people a year nationally, about 357 detentions per 100,000 people across the country. Now that is dramatically high. So that is double, triple, or more the rates in European countries where we could get similar data. And where there's better data, where they have more accurate tracking, the rates are even higher. So in Massachusetts, for example, 875 detentions per 100,000 people per year. San Francisco County, 1,600. And this is just a sampling where we got better data as a result of more careful tracking. So you can see here that the numbers are just becoming astronomical. And this is really what needs to be in the public dialogue and debate right now. It's not, oh, we need to be forcibly treating more people. We need to be saying, why are we using these forced interventions at such astronomically high rates? And it's apparently not helping and may even be backfiring. And so I want to talk about who these people are. Who are they now? And this is what I really explore extensively throughout the book. And what I found is that these powers are used in many more settings than is commonly being reported. I did find news stories kind of at a regional level or local levels for some of these kinds of instances. And the individuals that I talked to, I found corroboration. I sometimes found little studies that had followed up with it and so on and so forth. But by and large, this is not part of the national dialogue beyond the one group, which we'll talk about, which is homeless people. That's part of the national dialogue. But they're only one subset of the people who are getting subjected to these laws. And I think that's really important. So what I found is that these laws are very flexibly used in all sorts of social and institutional management contexts. So let's start with the most common one that people know, and that is unhoused populations. And what I found here is that, in fact, there's a gross exaggeration of the prevalence of mental illness in these populations. So, for example, this is just a new one from 2023, California survey of homeless people. They found that 82% reported a period in their life where they experienced a serious mental health condition, and they had a depression at 69%, hallucinations at 23%. So for sure, that sounds like really high, right? Right? And that's how it's instinctively reported. Like 82% of homeless people are mentally ill. Oh my God, 23% are hallucinating. Like, these people are crazy, right? That's the narrative that's out there publicly. And I got to say, it's a narrative that's not only really, really insulting and abusive to these people, but it's flat out wrong. So here are some of the things that aren't being controlled. So they don't control for impacts of homelessness itself, obviously. How long can you live on the street before you start experiencing depression or anxiety? I submit to you, not very long. I'm surprised these numbers are not 100% across the board. They often include drinking and drug use as a mental disorder, but are they really a mental disorder? Or again, often just a case of a response to what's happening, or just a separate kind of situation altogether, why a person might be drinking. They exacerbate diagnostic inflation. Like, usually these numbers are simply derived from screening surveys. So maybe a 5-question survey where I say something to you like, hey, over the last 2 weeks, have you felt really, really, really sad? And that's actually a typical question that gets asked here. And if you answer that, well, guess what? You now qualify as depressed for the purposes of these kinds of surveys. So that obviously drives the rates really high. They also use a lifetime prevalence rate. So look at that phrasing, reported a period in their life where, right? So this is not just right now, it's just saying at some point they met these criteria. And they don't compare to the general population. And this is crucial because, as I already said, the lifetime prevalence of mental disorders in the general population is as high as these numbers, 61% to 80%. The lifetime prevalence of hallucinations, when you find studies like that, in the general population, it ranges from 15% to 80%. So what are these numbers telling us? Really nothing at all. They're simply telling us that, hey, guess what? Homeless people too also struggle just like people in the general population, and probably struggle more than the general population, largely due to their conditions. And it's not to say there's nobody on the street who's really, really struggling. Clearly there is, just like there's people who are not living on the street who's really, really struggling emotionally or mentally or psychologically in some way. But I'm just trying to highlight, we've kind of exaggerated the degree to which this is a major factor in unhoused populations. So what's the real driver? What's really going on? And I'm saying to you, it's policing. We're just trying to police these people, and we're coming up a reason to do it. All of these cities, this is a study that's just a great study from the complaint-oriented policing, and this fellow found that really across America, there's been all these laws passed to control homeless populations, banning camping, banning city, banning lying in public, just making it criminal essentially to be homeless at all. And this is what has motivated cities. And all of this is actually backfiring. And this is a great example in this study. So we found that in San Francisco, over this 4-year period, 5-year period, where homelessness only increased 1%, nevertheless, complaints about the unhoused population increased dramatically, hundreds of percent between 911 and 311, which was the city service line. And then at the same time, less than 7,000 homeless people in San Francisco. There were these hundreds of thousands of complaints about them. The average homeless person had 26 complaints about them in 1 year. And what they found in this study, as they followed these people and followed police officers doing this, is they found that all that was happening is these people were just being moved around the city. So, right, the police would come up and say, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that. And they might throw them in jail, or they might take them to a psychiatric institution, or they might just tell them to move along. And so the person would move along, and then someone else would complain about them. And this was just happening. And so this is why actually the whole thing is backfiring. The aggressive policing of homeless people is simply causing more aggravation for homeless people and more aggravation for non-homeless people, because it's making the whole problem more visible and more complicated and more difficult to live with for everyone. By closing these places where people find encampments or some form of respite for a little while, we've just made everything more difficult, and it's backfiring. Again, I think this really needs to be part of the public dialogue, much more than it currently is. So I always want to highlight this study. And we see this manifesting now at an institutional level, at a city level. So, for example, Disability Rights Oregon did this tremendous investigation report, and they found that in 2019, in that 1 year, more unhoused people in Portland were arrested or detained than the federal homelessness count even found in the city, right? So extremely aggressive. I laugh, right? But you can only laugh at the absurdity of this. But of course, it must be enormously painful for the people living through this, right? To just, you just basically can't be homeless without being subjected to these kinds of arrests and detainment all the time. And this manifested in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has been prosecuting this problem. They, under the Americans with Disability Acts, has been happening in multiple states across the country. Multiple states are having these multi-year sort of lawsuit processes with the DOJ, because the DOJ has found that tens of thousands of people in many states, across all of these states together, are being unnecessarily institutionalized in psychiatric settings. And it's primarily because there's nowhere else for them to go. So what's happening is, yeah, they're getting pulled in off the street. They're getting locked in a psychiatric hospital. Then the doctor's going, well, they don't actually meet the criteria to be locked up. But on the other hand, there's nowhere for them to go. So we'll just keep them here because they're just going to end up homeless and they'll deteriorate anyway. So we'll keep them locked up. And that's what's happening en masse around the country. It's so much so, as I said, that, in this 5-year period alone, the DOJ really managed to get the release, or at least the proposed release, of tens of thousands of people in multiple states. But it's a process, because what the settlements usually mandate that states build more affordable housing, build more supportive housing, because some of these people might not do well on their own, sure, and they need some kind of supportive housing. And so often that's built into these settlements. But of course, that can take years to build that kind of extra housing. And there's a lot of feet dragging that goes on. So yeah, this is a massive political problem that, again, is under discussed. Now, I want to emphasize, that's just one subgroup, though. That is not even, and outside of urban settings, as near as we can tell, major urban settings, it may not even be the largest group, though we don't have really good data on who's being committed. But these are some of the other groups that are being committed a lot. So definitely families use these kinds of laws a lot. So at the individual family level, often escalating to guardianships. People will call 911 on a loved one, get them locked up, get them forcibly treated, commit to that process, collaborate with the doctors, often against another. And this can become very questionable, very corrupt. And to this day, I want to emphasize, even though I think a lot of the public now sides with Britney Spears and says she was improperly put under a guardianship, and how could you not think that when she was obviously perfectly functional for a decade and performing internationally at the same time as she was under a guardianship that her father had won over her. Still to this day, of course, her father would say, and some of the people around her would say, oh, no, that was appropriate. We needed that level of control. And this is what average people are up against, right, in these kinds of settings. So it's highly questionable what's happening, but definitely we know that families use mental health laws against each other a lot. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing in the particular families that's up for debate, but it definitely is a massive part of the culture. We're seeing this rising use of it in school settings. And it is the case that wherever we can get data on this, definitely children and youth are the fastest rising people who are getting subjected to these kinds of forced psychiatric interventions. And it looks like schools are a main driver of it. So essentially, in unruly schools where their class sizes are too large or whatever it is that's driving this need, parents and teachers, administrators are finding that getting police to come to take kids away to the psychiatric hospital is a tool for intervening either with distressed children or disruptive children and getting them labeled, potentially getting them tranquilized, sedated in some way, some kind of numbing drug, and as part of the institutional operation. And we're seeing more and more media covering this where we can find statistics. Florida has really good stats on this, and it's been quite scandalous, and the government is now actually trying to reduce it. They're trying to find some way to institutionally reduce the use of forced treatment against children because it's become so obvious. But there are other states that are doing this where it's been reported, and other ones where it just isn't being tracked, so we don't know. Nursing homes love to use antipsychotics for behavior control. This is so widely known that even the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services has flagged it, and they've had a 10-year process collaborating with all sorts of institutional actors trying to reduce the amount of antipsychotic drugging going on in nursing homes. Because what happens is as soon as the family members or the person themselves put up any kind of resistance, mental health laws get invoked to implement it, or other laws are often in place, guardianships and so on, get used to implement it. And it's just widespread institutional level use of these drugs. And it's even worse in Canada. For any of you who are out there in Canada, I will add the rates are even double what they are typically in institutional settings in America, and I don't know exactly why that is, but it may be because it's much more publicly funded in Canada. That's one of the downsides of the public funding that most Canadians do love anyway, but in this kind of situation, it can backfire. So I was surprised to discover the extensive use of this in workplace settings. So what's happening is that conflict resolution, and particularly in licensing actions, so bodies that are licensed, like ironically doctors and psychiatrists, but also nurses and social workers, any professions that are licensed, they're often in these kind of settings, they can end up sort of under threat of losing their license if they don't comply with treatment. Perhaps they've looked for drug treatment support of some kind, or they've looked for depression treatment or anxiety treatment support of some kind. And often they can end up in a situation where they're then being coerced. And this is really quite more widespread than I understood. There have been doctors speaking out against it, their physician health program, and it's often used now by corporate settings to control workers. So there has been some articles here from, I think it was NBC News, where they found a whole bunch of people working at Google. When they had complained about sexism and racism in the workplace, they were told to get mental health help instead of their actual issue being addressed. And so again, this is sort of surfacing a bit, but isn't really being widely talked about. I then found also that banks, airports, tax authority, government agencies of all kinds use mental health laws in a very flexible way to deal with complainants and protesters. The picture here is of a fellow who kind of became a bit of a friend of mine. Gordon Stewart, he had been protesting in Canada against Revenue Canada, and they called 911 on him, and he ended up locked up in a psychiatric hospital for 10 days, even though all he was doing was protesting, and he had documented evidence that Revenue Canada had done him wrong. They used this tool against him successfully for a little while, and he was very, very intimidated by it, as you can imagine. And then I found that this is policy. So the US IRS has this in their manual, instructions on the types of people they're looking for, the types of situations when their employees are being instructed to actually call 911 or contact mental health authorities or do something in response to people of different kinds. And a couple audits of this program actually said that the employees weren't using it enough. This Treasury Inspector General was saying, no, no, no. I found all sorts of circumstances where, technically the employee should have called 911 on this person. And instead the employee went, it's not a big deal, I won't bother. And oh no, they weren't allowed to do this. They were being told, no, you have to call if they meet these criteria. And these criteria to me looked pretty broad. And then against whistleblowers. So I want to highlight this quote because I just found isolated cases, but then I contacted the Government Accountability Project, and the legal director there said, oh yeah, he said, this is totally common that whistleblowers in the United States, it's one of the first things he says to them when they come to him is, you are going to be forced into a psychiatric evaluation. You may get locked up against your will. They are going to try to portray you as crazy. And this is a picture of Adrian Schoolcraft, who was a New York Police Department whistleblower, blowing the whistle on corruption in the police force, and he ended up locked up by his fellow officers, made up a bunch of lies about him, and got him locked up in Jamaica Hospital in New York for 6 days, where he was held against his will. And now he ultimately had all kinds of documented evidence to prove that he was not paranoid, but that was the story they gave when he said, hey, all these police officers are conspiring against me. He sounded crazy to the psychiatrist. But fortunately for him, he ultimately could bring together all the evidence that proved all this corruption, and he ultimately won lawsuits against the city and against the hospital. But of course, most people can't necessarily do that in this kind of a situation, so it's extremely dangerous. And so that quote, Tom Devine called it a bread and butter harassment tactic. Pregnant women, this is another huge group going on around the country now. They're being targeted by mental health laws. Some states are actually writing laws specifically for them. So it's to control women who might be seeking an abortion, to control women who might be using recreational drugs, because it's a stronger prejudice against recreational drugs than there is against common psychiatric drugs that they might end up being forcibly treated with. And so this controlling of pregnant women, often mental health laws are being invoked. And again, as you can see, this is a New York Times article. It's hitting some of the mainstream media now because, of course, there is, with the fall of Roe versus Wade, there's much more aggressive policing of these pregnant people going on around the country in certain states. Now, another one is just flat out money making. And of course, this can be either corrupt or just legitimate, right? Because just a lot of people are making a lot of money. So really, I'll just skip over these numbers. This is a sort of back of serviette calculation I did, but you can see at the bottom, it adds up to like, it looks like forced psychiatric interventions, or at least a $19 billion a year industry in America. And that's really the low end of how much money we're talking about here. And that's including public and private. And so we do see mass scale fraud going on. This is one in Tampa Bay that got exposed. You're trapped, they're cashing in. But here's an even better example. This was the Department of Justice actually even waded in. They settled with Universal Health Services, which is incidentally the biggest psychiatric chain in America. They have 200 psychiatric hospitals, and they settled in 2020 for $117 million and the settlement stated that they were hospitalizing people who did not require hospitalization and improperly using physical and chemical restraints and seclusion to keep these people docile, to keep them trapped. And you can only wonder, how much did $117 million represent in terms of how many people was that? And for how long were these people being detained against their will? You'd really have to get in the details that might not be publicly accessible to find out how many people did this really involve, and how many other people, did it, weren't included in the end in that settlement. And did those people get any money? I don't think they did. They would have to sue separately. And some did, in fact, sue separately to try to get a settlement who were involved in this situation. But I'm sure many did not. So it's a lot of people. All right. Now, getting close to wrapping up here, I just want to talk about the kind of the future of what's really happening, and that's community long-term coercion. Because everything we've talked about so far largely happens inside institutions at some point in time, one way or another. But coercion in the community is expanding. Now, assisted outpatient treatment is involuntary, technically. It's in outpatient commitment. But ACT, assertive community treatment, ACT, is supposed to, in most cases, be voluntary. But here's a survey of people who work on ACT teams, and you see there that these are very coercive. They admit that they frequently or always deliver medications. 85% made sure the client swallowed, 71% firmly directed the consumer to take the medications, and in a third of cases, they actually committed the consumer if the consumer rebelled against them in some way. So even these ACT teams can be enormously coercive. Also, a survey across 5 US cities found that more than 50% of people accessing voluntary outpatient services had experienced threats to remain treatment compliant with their housing, their Social Security, income, or another leverage held over them in some way. So again, this kind of community coercion, it's extra legal, it's outside the legal system. You don't really have any rights, but people are being pressured, threatened, coerced, and may ultimately end up locked up because of just the people that are around them, the people that they're turning to for help. And here's a great example, some hard data I found. It's from California. So officially, the assisted outpatient treatment rates in California are actually very low compared to other states. They don't have a lot of people formally committed in an outpatient setting. Nevertheless, they have somewhere between 40 and 70,000 people who are quote unquote voluntarily in what they call a full service program. So that's basically 24/7 wraparound services. Sometimes they'll have assertive community treatment teams. They'll live in residential settings. Now, an independent study found that in these full service partnerships, more than 64% Nevertheless, even though they were supposed to be voluntary, they required treatment compliance. Either you were threatened with losing your housing, or you were threatened with losing your supports, or both, if you did not comply with treatment. So for all intents and purposes, these functioned like assisted outpatient treatment. These were forced outpatient commitment for all intents and purposes. And no, this is many more times people right here alone than were ever in inpatient psychiatric care at any time in California. So this is really important number to know, and a really important group of people for us to understand more about. And overall, help seeking has become really risky. That's what we're talking about here. So I want to talk about the latest numbers we have from 988, that they engage in call tracing. So you may meet the criteria for some way, a really broad policy they have, that you could be at risk of harming yourself, at risk of harming others in some way. If you kind of meet those criteria, they may get your call traced against your will and have police sent to bring you in, or first responders to bring you in. And the latest national survey that was done by the NRI, the research arm of the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, so very reliable survey. It was actually 7.8% of all calls ended up getting these kinds of policing, emergency mental services interventions. And that's separate from mobile crisis teams, I'll add. Mobile crisis teams is a whole other thing. This is more like policing interventions. People were just being swept up, usually taken to a psychiatric hospital or a crisis facility of some kind. And that is 4 times higher than the 1 to 2% rate that they typically say. And New Mexico data showed that that was a really high rate of people calling with suicidal feelings. So the very reason a lot of people are calling a suicide prevention line to discuss suicidal feelings, they're the most likely to get these kind of policing interventions, ranging as high as 20%. And that was 380,000 people in 1 year alone, nearly 10 times the number, because the overall number of calls is increasing. So almost 10 times, 8 to 10 times increase in the overall number of people being affected, and a 4% increase in the rate overall. So dramatic increases that really should be being talked about. Like, what's causing this? What's going on? And I asked, I gave SAMHSA and I gave Vibrant Emotional Health, the administrators of 988, months to respond to a series of questions about this. They refused to answer any of my questions about what was happening, whether they were concerned, anything at all. Now, and I want to highlight, so mobile crisis teams, certainly is an effort out there going on to have more of them respond rather than police, which is a good thing. Fewer people will be shot if that happens. However, they also forcibly hospitalize people at a very high rate, or we don't know if it's forced, I must say. It could be somewhat coerced. It could be fully voluntary. We don't really have that data, but essentially 27% of people on average who are getting these mobile crisis team visits end up being taken to a psychiatric hospital or a crisis care facility anyway. So pretty high rates that are also relevant. So does all this help? Here's some quotes from the peer-reviewed literature about it all. Use of seclusion, physical and chemical restraints are, quote, very common in psychiatric hospitalization, despite a remarkable lack of evidence to support their use. As I said earlier, if you want the actual citations for this, just come to me. But essentially, these conclusions are being based on really small numbers of studies, because it's just not studied overall. Locked wards, constant monitoring, emergency medications are not supported by evidence and are difficult to justify. Psychiatric forced medication is a remarkably understudied practice. Involuntary treatment is based on tradition rather than evidence. There's no evidence for public safety arguments. There's no reductions in serious violence or suicides as a result of forced psychiatric interventions. So the short answer to the question is, forced psychiatric interventions are a fundamental daily part of how the mental health system operates across America, and indeed really across the world. And there's no evidence, no scientific evidence to support their use. And this is in summary, like that, coercive interventions in mental health care continue to be used extensively, although there's little evidence that confer any clinical benefits, and they're often associated with negative outcomes. So the kind of things we're hearing about people feeling traumatized, feeling humiliated, feeling brutalized. And that is why, under the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the United Nations arrived at the conclusion that forced interventions constitute arbitrary detention and torture under various other conventions related to the United Nations. So that's where the United Nations and the World Health Organization has ended up. They are essentially now advocating for the complete abolishment of forced psychiatric interventions, saying that they constitute arbitrary detention and torture. And that's groundbreaking. That's really important, right? We've never had such prominent, high-profile institutions internationally advocating for full-on abolition. So what can we do? Well, we can abolish it, and I think that's probably what needs to happen. And the World Health Organization has issued guides to this, and there's many ways. And they, in fact, featured Afia House, Wildflower Alliance's own respite, as one of the ways that can help divert people from forced institutionalization settings for short periods, getting peer involvement in all sorts of institutional settings, non-hierarchical and open engagement type settings, multidisciplinary teams involved, making them more welcoming, having diverse activities for patients so that they actually want to come and get help and they find the help helpful, having more non-medical therapeutic options available for people, and so on. All of these could be part of the abolition of forced treatment, just making it more pleasant to actually seek out help and hopefully get it. It's not going to be more costly, and there's a lot to say that it could be more helpful for people. But if we don't get that, because we're going in the opposite direction now as a culture, so let's talk about what can we do that's maybe just a more humble goal, but that's very achievable in the immediate future. And that would be more housing and housing first type approaches, people getting supportive housing. We just need better data and outcomes tracking. Hey, why aren't we tracking what happens to people? We have lots of other, if people have heart attacks in America, you can find detailed data on which hospitals serve their needs better than other hospitals, who leaves that hospital cured and who doesn't, and all this. You can get that kind of data. Why not for forced psychiatric interventions? We should know what's happening to people when this happens to them. Do they get better? Do they get worse? Do they stay the same? What are they reporting? Objectively, what's changing in their lives? Are they getting jobs? Are they getting housing? All of these kinds of things. We could easily track it, and nowhere are they tracking this right now. Nowhere. Put pressure on governments to start tracking this, and on institutions. We could narrow the commitment criteria. Obviously, they've been so broadened, it's really out of control. We need to strengthen regulatory oversight. I have a few chapters in my book where I look at the complete lack of oversight. Even really, really abusive facilities that have been exposed don't get shut down. It's so rare for these institutions to be shut down. And we need clearer standards of care. That's one of the problems now. It's very amorphous. What even qualifies as psychiatric care? Ironically, even the Department of Justice admitted that to me in the interview, where I said, how do you even tell between forced treatment that's quote unquote legal versus quote unquote abusive and illegal? Because they look the same, right? In both cases, you're strapping somebody down, you're forcibly drugging them with a heavy duty antipsychotic that pretty much knocks them out, you're restraining them. This is both legal and it's abusive. And they admitted that that was challenging for them. Even when they were investigating a facility, said it could take them years to really sort out, was this actually abusive? And often it came down to things like whether they were billing improperly or not, because they couldn't tell from the treatment alone. The treatment was kind of inherently not very pretty to look at. So it would be more something like they were billing 24 hours a day for the same patient, and the patient couldn't possibly have taken that many possible different forms of treatment in that time span. And they would catch them on billing fraud rather than anything else. So, I mean, that's just painful to hear and to think about, I think. We need more class actions, and some of these are done by the disability rights organizations in different states that are funded to do this. The protection and advocacy organizations are called. Well, we need more of those for sure, because they do affect change, albeit slowly and not as radically as they want, but sometimes they can be helpful. Psychiatric advance directives would be great. more authority for you to say, here's what I would like if I'm ever declared incompetent, if I'm ever declared incapable, here's what I find helpful, here's what I don't want, and if those would actually be followed. They're on the books in many states, but they're just not followed. So just stricter enforcement around them, making it clear what you can and can't ask for. Enhancing community mutual aid would obviously be great. The more we can all do that for each other. But why aren't these being implemented? Because a lot of those things, as I just said, they're actually cheaper in a lot of cases. Well, there's political resistance against them. That's why they're not being implemented. So we need to demedicalize the current legislative authority. Like currently under the Mental Health Act in every state, absolute powers ultimately given to the medical professional, to the psychiatrist or physician. They have final decision-making power under that law. Why, right? There's a historical reason for that, but I would ask the broader question, why? Why should we have that? Maybe it should be a multidisciplinary team. You know, maybe we still have that law in the books, but somebody else is in charge. Why does it have to be a medical doctor? This is really a problem that they're the ones with absolute power. And how about we address what these institutional needs are? Why are schools really turning to mental health laws? Maybe there's some other thing they're struggling with that we could address in a different way. Why are nursing homes using these laws? Maybe they have some different issues that we could address in a different way. So looking at this institution by institution. Then I just want to highlight something we can all do, which is when we're talking about this, separate policing from helping, because often these things are getting conflated, right? You'll be in a discussion and someone will say, well, we really want to help that homeless person. And you'll say, well, this isn't helping them, it's abusing them. And then they'll say, yeah, but they're dangerous. And that's why we have to do this. And so we don't want to have these kind of like dialogues that flow between the two. Look, if somebody truly is dangerous, let's define that, let's make it clear, and let's decide, is a mental health system the appropriate way to handle a truly dangerous person, someone who's physically violent? Is that the appropriate way to handle that person? Or is there some other method we want to use of trying to control and police somebody that we think is physically dangerous? And as for the person we truly want to help, okay, you know, let's talk about that, because clearly then the person's own opinion is really crucial then. If they're saying, hey, I find this helpful versus I don't find this helpful. So let's just make clear what we're talking about. Are we talking about policing people, or are we talking about helping people? Which is it? And try not to conflate those two discussions. And as I said, the answers to those questions could be different in every case still, right? But at least the dialogue would be a little bit clearer. And also detention from treatment. Because again, we talk about involuntary commitment. Well, there's a big difference. Like, you know what? If I'm doing something that's really off the hook, you know, and I am threatening people or whatever, and somebody says, hey, we got to control Rob, you know what? Maybe I have less of a problem with that than if you're trying to muddle with my brain. You know what I mean? Okay, the police come, the police take me to some setting or other, and I'm detained for a while. And maybe, you know, I take that time where I go, all right, I can see why I was aggravating people and frightening them or whatever. And I make some changes in myself that help, right? I might do it. Like, I'm just envisioning myself in this scenario, right? You may see something different here. But in that scenario, I'm more comfortable with that than I am with you putting electrical nodes on my head and electroshocking me, or giving me a drug that I really don't want that makes me feel ill, you know, and tranquilizing my brain. Like, this is a whole order of magnitude different, I think. And I think for many people it is. So when we have the public dialogue, let's talk about that. Let's talk about situations where we feel we might be able to justify detaining someone for a short period of time, versus actually getting into their brain and mucking around with their brain in some way that may not have any science to support it. Separate those two things out in the public dialogue. And that's part of my overall effort here, which is to increase public understanding of what's truly happening. We need to do that, because I think the mass of people out there have no clue about 90% of what we've just talked about here. They really don't. They just have a very superficial idea that, oh, people are mentally ill, we're going to lock them up, we're going to forcibly drug them, we're going to help them, they're going to be so happy and grateful. That's most people's view of what's happening. And I hope, you know, as you know, and as I've tried to show today, that is totally not what's happening in the vast majority of cases. So let's make people more aware of what's happening. All right, so that is the end. Again, there's my email address and my website and references for this talk. Feel free to get in touch at any time. That's the conclusion of my talk, but I'm really excited to hear those of you who can stay for the next chunk of time here. We'll have maybe a little break now for a few minutes and then come back for discussion. I'd love to hear your responses to what you've heard, your own experiences that might contribute in some way to people's understanding of what this is like to go through if you've gone through it, or a family member or someone you know has, and so on. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. It's what makes it for me is this opportunity now to hear from you, because I know the reason you attended this talk is probably because you have some knowledge to share as well, and I hope you will share it.
Thank you so much, Rob. I won't read the comments in the chat yet. Let's come back at 4:13. That'll give us all a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 4:13 and then we'll start asking questions. All
All
right.
right.
Thanks for
Thank you.
everyone's patience. Hi, I'm just seeing the question from DJ. The silence is somewhat intentional. We're just taking a brief break after Rob's presentation. We will kick it back up in a few minutes. I cardinal sin of talking while muted. Just a couple more minutes, one more minute, and we'll get going again. Great job, Rob. I didn't see the PowerPoint last time. It was really good to see it.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I see a really kind comment there in the chat too. Thank you, David. Oh,
If you check in the chat, you can see a recent podcast appearance by Rob. I think some of our post PowerPoint folks are coming back in. That's
yeah.
great.
And hey, Hunter. Yeah, thanks for posting that. And that was a super fun conversation. Uh, I with Hunter there. So others, even if you might have heard me before, you might find that conversation with Hunter that he posted there pretty interesting.
All right. So we are back to it. Just to keep things orderly, I'm just going to make one big ask. I'm going to ask folks to ask one question at a time. I'm in Western Mass. We are often guilty of the asking 5 questions at once thing. I'm just asking for today, just so everybody gets a chance, ask one. I'll ask folks to, if you are able to unmute, to raise your hand, and I'll unmute you so that you can ask your question. Then I'll mute you right after that. If you aren't able to unmute, then you can put your question in the chat and I will get to it as soon as I can, and we'll answer as many questions as we can. Sound fair, Rob?
Yeah.
All right. We have our first question.
Hi, this is Ruth, Ruthless. Thank you so much for your presentation. I read your book and I think it's amazing. I'm an unhoused person. I live outside, right? And one of my biggest challenges is having the city come with like a bulldozer or a garbage truck and take all of my things, like my food, clothing, and shelter. And I just like think that it's really frustrating that now a lack of food, clothing, and shelter is a criteria for gravely disabled. How do you think that people can like protect themselves, especially when the city's the one taking away their food, clothing, and shelter? Like, do you think, what do you think, like limits or amounts, like how much food would be enough, right? Like, do you have any insights about how people can prepare or deal with that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. And yeah, I feel for you totally. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And it's a problem, right? Let's not paint this in any other way, right? Like, because the definition of quote unquote mental disorder is so amorphous, and then there are these broad criteria around that you can't take care of your own food, shelter, clothing, whatever. And even in California, some of those criteria got even weirder, right? Even broader around what you supposedly could or couldn't, take care of, right? Your safety. I think they actually worded it now to something even vaguer as your own safety, whatever that means. So yeah, there is a risk. That's what I'm just trying to, no question. You're completely right to be concerned about it. And so then we just back up to really, in that sense, just what generally can one do to protect oneself better in these kinds of situations? And all I'd say is, the best things I know that have overall helped really anyone is social connections. So you've got friends, family, whoever who can vouch for you, who might show up in a situation like that and go, hey, wait a minute, she's not crazy, she's my friend. That kind of thing. And just like, sure, she's a little wacky sometimes, but I love her, right? Whatever they might say that will just, make you seem as you are, like a person who has a social connections in this world. Because it's really, a lot of times these kinds of diagnoses happen in isolation, and they're about isolating people and making them seem like you can't handle anything. In particular, this one, right? This notion of like, you can't handle it, you can't take care of yourself. So even if you have right off the the bat, someone who says, you know, hey, I've never seen her starving, you know, I've never seen her not, it only happened when they took that away, otherwise she's good. That's great, right, to have the evidence there of another person who can verify what you just said, right? Because they often pathologize the person who's talking about themselves, and that's the worst thing, right? It's unfortunate. And so, but they aren't as ready to do it to whoever else comes in off the street with you. So again, if you can just, you know, bring in anybody else, that's helpful. I mean, you're gonna need to fight it in California, and it's new law there, so it's unclear how it's going to be applied. You know, if you have a good lawyer, that can make a difference, because technically it's not really legal under the way the Supreme Court actually gave direction to states on forced treatment. They aren't supposed to do this. So if you have a really good lawyer who can kind of make a good case in court, that will help. You know, and I know it can be hard to find these lawyers, but I don't know if others here have suggestions from their own experiences with that, because it's happening in every state, that they might offer up at some point. But those are my best two: is social connections, lawyer, and just making that statement very clearly, you know, the one you just made. If they've taken it away, to go, the only reason I don't have these things right now is because they were taken away, you know, and make a judge confront that, you know, if you're in that situation.
Thank you. Our next person is Jaden. I'm going to ask you to unmute now. There you go.
Thank you. Hello. So my question is sort of about the prevalence of the fact that there is not really a specific federal, but mostly also state law within regards to how somebody should handle suicidal ideation, and how to report it with mandated reporting. I realized that there is a lot of obfuscating what it actually means when it comes to mandated reporting and being a danger to others versus being a danger to yourself. For instance, like even just in my human services degree program, we would be forced to do it in our assignments, say specifically, like if you're going to hurt yourself or others, in our criteria for like how we would handle situations. But in the actual like academic wording would be, if you like if you're going to be a danger to others, you must be reporting. But when you're a danger to yourself, you can be reporting. And it was sort of like obviously, you know, not quite explained fully that way. So it's like there's like this sort of different standards there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem, right? This whole thing of mandated reporting, and as you highlight, it's a bit fluid. It's more fluid than people realize often, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and licensing body to licensing body, how it gets worded and what the requirements supposedly are or aren't. So, you know, without getting into the weeds of it, you know, in any particular state or any particular licensing group or whatever, generally what we know is that, you know, they word it in such an amorphous way that there is a lot of leeway there, and it really becomes whether or not someone's going to complain right after the fact if something in fact does happen and you did or didn't report, right? And that's often what it's about, not really what was right or wrong or what the policy did or didn't say. It's going to be what a judge thinks if it lands in a lawsuit because somebody actually died or somebody actually ended up harmed in some way. And you know, it's really hard to say, again, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, how that might end up playing out. I think it's just a bad law because it, you know, it makes people not talk about their feelings. But that's really where we're at right now. And I think that's what you need to do. Like I would never talk with a professional, a licensing professional. And I think licensing professionals should be very clear about their own lines. I think that's the best solution. If you're working in this space, you say to somebody when they first see you, oh, by the way, unbidden, I'm now going to tell you, if you say this, this, or this, I feel that I must report you. So I'm just letting you know that right now. Give it to them in writing. You know, so then that person can make that decision themselves, whether they're going to disclose that to you or not. At least it's upfront and transparent. And honestly, I've talked with some psychiatrists that I have some respect for. And that's what they do. They just flat out say, look, if you say this, I'm going to get you locked up. Okay. Okay. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Right. Like, and cause I'll be worried about you. And so, and they hope, and I think rightly so, that it actually builds trust with their client, with their patient, right? They think now that patient knows. And so if they disclose that to me, at least if I do feel I have to do it, that won't breach the trust because I was honest with them, about it. And so they're hoping that this will maintain that therapeutic alliance, which, as we all know, all the science shows is absolutely crucial for people to feel comfortable and to often heal or improve, is to feel that they actually are being respected and there's an alliance with whoever's trying to help them.
I have clearly not been on Zoom for a while. Just a reminder, if you have a question, raise your hand and we will get to you. If you're not able to unmute, you can ask the question in the chat. I'm going to read one before we get to you, Judy. Thank you for your patience. This is from Pauline. Hi from the Netherlands. I work as a volunteer all day, every day, and hear many stories about better safe than sorry, augmentations to the max of antipsychotics, etc. Withdrawal symptoms are terrible. Not really a question, but I hope doctors will realize that all too much must be tapered off. Doctors will realize all that too much must be tapered after hospitalization. Thank you for that, Pauline. And Judy, I'm going to unmute you now.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly affirm what Pauline's saying there, right? Like it's amazing how common these stories are, and not just across America, across North America, but the world like this, right? Like we hear this, I hear this all the time that, oh, better safe than sorry, right? That's the justification.
So Judy here. We had a recent experience, young adult in our family was hospitalized. She does have mental illness. She's been hospitalized many times. She needed to be hospitalized, although this time she did not think that she needed to be, but everyone around her, including her psychiatrist who issued a Section 12, knew that she needed to be hospitalized. She was restrained physically and says that she was restrained twice. It was obviously very traumatizing for her. And we had a lot of discussion afterwards about why didn't they try to de-escalate me? Why didn't they talk to me? It really made me think, wonder about the staffing. And of course, very frustrating as family members to have no idea what was going on there. Did she actually need to be restrained? And we think it actually led to a second hospitalization about a week and a half later because of the trauma of the restraining. So I think maybe staffing is, and especially maybe after COVID or because of COVID, is an issue too.
Yeah, and I'll just make a few comments on that. Well, I need to be hospitalized, right? Like, did she need to be, like, as you've already highlighted, well, maybe she didn't need to be restrained, right? And maybe there's another approach there. And I'd say, yeah, and maybe she didn't need to be forced into a hospital. I don't know how that ultimately played out, but this is an issue that comes up, right? I'd say, hey, you know what? If we had hospitals that were really inviting, really welcoming, that coercion was not even in the cards, but you could say, hey, to this person, if you go to the hospital, you're going to get this and you're going to get this. And wouldn't that be fantastic? Isn't that what you want right now? I think a lot more people are going to want to go, but instead, no, they get pathologized, they get humiliated, they often get subjected to coercion. You said that she'd experienced this before, it sounds like, so she probably knew full well. So, I'm sorry, but you have me right now. And if I'm flipping out and you say you should go to the hospital, Rob, I'm going to say no, because, not because I'm not in distress, but because I know what it's like to be there and I know what can happen, right? So again, we need to be real about this and kind of really look at it. And I think you're asking the right question there. You're saying, what about the staffing? And that's what I found in all my research is the problem here is, I think the heart of the problem is they have too much power. And because they have power, they cut corners all the time. They don't treat people with respect because they don't have to. They're just like, oh, let's stick a drug in them. Let's restrain them, because we can do that, because they don't even have the kinds of restraints on them as employees as they do in prison settings. They really don't. They have much more leeway in a psychiatric hospital to do these kinds of acts than an average prison guard does, and because they're supposedly doing to help people, and that should not be the case. If we're trying to help somebody, that should really, 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 truly be a last resort that is so far down the list, right, that I'd say it probably shouldn't even really exist, you know, except in a case where, yeah, there's clearly, as the Supreme Court indeed did say when they visited this, they said it should be tangible, physical threats that are manifesting immediately right now. That's something worth stopping. Anything short of that, no, we shouldn't be using force, right? And so, yeah, that's where we kind of end up. And I realize there's lots of debate around this. People, oh, you know, every kind of scenario is different. Every person is different. So I don't want to presume to bear judgment upon your situation, right? I don't know the details, right? So I'm not doing that. I'm just kind of, you know, extrapolating from some of the things you said in a more general way, right? How we need to think. And I think you're asking absolutely the right question in this case.
The locked room didn't help either.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Which
like
he
so
had
many.
previous experience with and knew that that's what was going to happen. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no evidence for it to be therapeutic in any way, right? Let alone that most people understandably reported as traumatizing.
All right. Mary Kate, I'm going to ask to unmute you.
Thanks so much, Rob and Earl and Wildflower, for hosting this event. I really appreciate it. I know some of this information, or I'm familiar of it just by working in the community. And it's maddening just in and of itself, the system and how it perpetuates itself. So I'm not really sure what my question is, but it's just becoming increasingly clear to me that it doesn't benefit the state, the federal government, to change any of these laws. In fact, I think they're going to be using them way more in order to remove all the undesirables from the population, because they're going to be able to do that. And at least that's what's coming up for me. And I know that all of this is based on fear. So I'm just thinking about like the abolishment of, if we were to abolish the prison system, for example, I feel like they would just use other institutions to have the same effect. You know, I mean, it's sort of used interchangeably, I think, in a lot of ways to, again, institutionalize people who are undesirable. So it feels like one can't be abolished without the other. I think it's just going to make one more, you know, full. How do we shift the narrative around public safety and what's dangerous within our own individual sense? I think your work and your book is doing that somewhat, but how can we support the shift in belief around what is dangerous? You know, all those complaint calls whenever a homeless person shows up in your neighborhood, you know, or someone who's having a psychiatric event, or who's on drugs, or who's, you know, just somehow making you uncomfortable. And I guess the other thing, I don't know if there's a whole question in this. I am doing the Western Mass, too many questions. Sorry, Earl. But what was the last thing?
Well, while you're thinking about
about the protesters, that's the thing that really freaked me out. Just that protesters can be arrested and called crazy because they don't agree with the state. And we're just going to see more and more of that. So what can we do?
Yeah. Quickly on that last one, yeah, you'll look in my, I don't know if you've read my book, but there's a section where I look at how political dissidents in the former Soviet Union were incarcerated, and the psychiatric justifications that were used, and show that they're exactly parallel to what's going on in America today. You know, that how the psychiatrists thought about it in the Soviet Union is very similar to how an average psychiatrist here thinks today, which is why the World Psychiatric Association actually found it very difficult to sanction the Soviet psychiatrists in that era. And I kind of cover that in the book. So yeah, you know, in the first part of what you're talking about, now I'm forgetting, that was sort of the last part. The I really wanted to get to your first part though, and now I've forgotten it. What were you talking about mainly there towards the end?
The
Shoot.
first part was like, can we abolish one without abolishing the other? This
Right, right. And yeah, I agree with
and then
you
how
on
do we
that.
change the belief around public
Yes,
safety?
yes. Well, oh, and I wanted to thank you there. Yeah. So one of the things I really want to emphasize, like I didn't talk today about personal stories, but they're all through my book, right? People who've experienced this. And I have to emphasize, those of you here today who've personally experienced this, your voices are so important. I couldn't have done the book without you. I can't do this journalism without you. You know, yes, anyone who's personally experienced this, and also if you work in this space, those people, very important voices. I have some of them in my book as well. The people who are thinking critically, and but actually working in the space in some way and are willing to kind of, you know, risk speaking out at the threat to maybe their career in some way, and also the people who are able, and I know it's hard, right, because of the bigotry in our society against people who've had these experiences, but wow, it makes a huge, like I can't tell you, if I'm standing on a stage, you know, with somebody, or just in a personal setting, you know, with someone, and I'm going through all my data and statistics, but then the person next to me says, oh yeah, I was locked up and forcibly treated against my will, you know, people's jaws just like fall off, you know, like, whoa, because they have these prejudices, they have these beliefs about people who've been locked up, you know. That's why one of the most powerful parts of my book is my dad, right? My dad, career college professor, computer engineer, had it happen. People need to hear that, and I do think it makes a difference. And honestly, I thought my book would make a bigger splash with the mainstream than it has so far, because I cover those kinds of stories. I thought, oh, when people hear about the whistleblowers and the elderly moms in nursing homes and the you know, all the quote unquote ordinary people that get subjected to these laws, they're going to care, right? And I still believe they would if they heard about it, but there is some blocking going on. And I believe, you know, others might have an opinion on this, and I'd be happy to hear it, but I believe that this desire to use mental health laws right now to police homeless populations is so powerful that it's overriding everything else. They don't want to hear about anything else right now. And so I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But finally, when people start going, hey, wait a minute, like we are seeing more celebrities, like Britney Spears was a bit of a shocker for people. Paris Hilton was a bit of a shocker for people, you know, and I think if we had more and more of that could make a difference as well. So those are just some of my initial thoughts, things you could do that make a difference. And so I just want to, you know, thank everyone who does speak out about this.
You, Louise, I always not sure if I'm getting that right. Louise?
You were talking about hospitals and the fact that you can find out which hospitals are really good at doing what, and which hospitals are really bad. So, and then I think you went on and you said these are some of the reasons why we don't close these institutions down. So I didn't catch all of that, and I just wanted to know what are the reasons why don't we close these mental health institutions down?
Well, there's a narrative out there that's to some degree is real, because we've overloaded these beds with so many people that there's a shortage, right? Like I want to be careful with the word shortage, because as I show, we have a lot of beds, but we really are overloading them. And so governments are very reluctant to close any institutions because they're all full. They're all full. And so they know, what are we going to do with these people if we close one, you know? And then another part of it is, I think that they honestly don't know what to do, because there's no science in this, right? Like, again, if we have a hospital where, hey, you can show that like 50% of people who got heart surgery there ended up dead a week later, that's hard evidence, right? Because you can show, hey, at every other hospital, less than 0.1% end up dead a week later for heart surgery. That's hard evidence. Shut that place down. Get rid of everyone who works there, right? That's clear. But with mental health, we're not tracking outcomes to begin with. So they can't even really say, oh, this institution's worse than that institution. I can tell you the only reason it even becomes an issue is if there's a battering ram going at this. So for example, ABC News in Denver had a great journalist go at Clearview Hospital down there for 2 years straight. So this is a mainstream publication. This guy was a great journalist. He's done awesome work. He's won billions of awards. He's like one of these, and he just realized what was going on when he started to hear from people. He had no prejudices about people who'd been labeled with mental illness, and he waded in, and then he started talking to employees, and he went, this hospital's abusive, and he started writing about it, like not just once, but again and again and again. And finally, more and more employees were coming out saying how bad it was. And then the medical director confessed and quit and all this stuff. And so the government was forced to finally shut it down, right? Because of the glare of public light on it that he was bringing. That's what happened. They never wanted to shut it down. It took 2 years, right? That's what happens. And those are the only kind of cases I've seen where they actually shut a place down. The regulation is just so bad. And as I said to him, I phoned him up and we had a great sort of chat. and I said to him, like what I'm seeing here is a hospital that's really not worse than tons of other hospitals I've seen, and he's going, you're doing good work, Rob, you're doing important work. Like, because I think he was starting to see that too. So yeah, this is the problem. You shut these places down, you have class action lawsuits, they just kind of revert to the mean after a while. And so we have a real regulation problem going on. And I think that traces back to the lack of science. And then I think it traces back to the laws. They just should not have these powerful laws. You look at any institution throughout history, you find an institution that had inordinate power over its own clients, you will find an abusive institution, right? And that was like residential schools for Indigenous kids. Guess what? They were extremely abusive. Orphanages for little children. Guess what? They were extremely abusive, right? So that's what's happening here. You just have unfair, out of control levels of power. If patients had way more power, guess what? These institutions would have no choice but to treat them better because they'd simply leave otherwise, right? And so that's how I trace the line of it. And I go, it goes back to the power, and it goes back to the, the acceptance of this kind of abuse in our society right now.
Caroline, there you go. Master, unmute you.
Oh, nice meeting you too, Earl. Thank you so much again. I'm always going to say this to you, Rob. Thank you for writing your book. Yeah, I did learn a few things about your book. I learned an enormous amount, but listening to it and reading it are better for me being with lived experience than just listening to it, because I seem to get a little riled up sometimes. But anyway, so if I can talk, if you want to address this about the self-harm and harm to others, I have a couple questions too. So, because Mary Kate brought up dangerousness, and that seems to be like a trigger word in our society, especially the last 3 years, is dangerous. They want everybody to be seen as dangerous. Okay, so there's all kinds of case law we have in America on the books for dangerous, but you're not called in any kind of civil commitment, like in my commitment. Self-harm to self and others translates into dangerousness in case law. And so, how to change the perception of that and to stop using that to be so abusive. But the other thing is there was a psychiatrist who posted something online the other day, and he wants to, should we force people with schizophrenia or mental illness who lack insight into their illness to get treated? And it's horrifying that over 80% of the people said, well, yes, or it depends. And so these people are saying that, yes, you should force treat these people because their lack of insight, which is a trigger word in terminology like non-compliance. And so how do we shift the narrative and really expose what is really happening behind this? Because the only thing that anybody ever fell in line with in my situation was medication management. All the faculty were poof. I mean, everybody was lined up. If you asked for any kind of help, medical, see an orthopedic doctor, anything like that, nobody had time, but they all had time to force drug you.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Like the word dangerousness has become very dangerous, really, because of its colloquial meaning in most people's minds. Like they just envision, whatever, right? They envision shootings, they envision, people being beat up, right? Whatever they envision when they hear danger. And that term has been embedded in mental health laws is so bad. And as there was a quote from Michael Perlin on my slide early on, right, where he talks about, he's a legal scholar in America, and says that, the definition of dangerousness has become very amorphous amorphous and vague, and pretty much judges have an attitude of, I know it when I see it, you know, and that's it. And I saw that in tons of cases that I've attended and cases I've read about, where you just, yeah, like judges and lawyers just kind of, oh, well, you know, and it can really be interpreted just very broadly as, oh, you know, this child wasn't able, they were too anxious to get to school. That means they're dangerous, right? Oh, this person was depressed and so they didn't really want to work as hard. Well, they're dangerous, right? That's how it's being interpreted in practice. It's extremely problematic. And, you know, the only solution I can think of is to get rid of that word, right, altogether from it. But as you say, it's serving a public purpose right now, and it gets really exploited and abused. And the Supreme Court attempted to define it, but that's been largely ignored in practice. So, you know, what can we do?
Yeah, because you would think dangerous has to do with violence, right?
Yeah.
If you're doing, yeah, they would be violent, but that's
Yeah,
not what it equals. Yeah.
That's right. And we have all these studies out there that show that, in fact, a person labeled with a mental disorder is actually equally or less likely to be violent than the average person in the population, right? They're more likely to be a victim of violence. And so that's the reality. And, you know, that's out there. That's widely known. But again, it's the prejudice. And I think we could get into really why people have such deep fear and bigotry about this, you know. And I think I can't help but think, again, right now, at least in our culture, a lot of it's motivated by a hatred for unhoused people, because I see that on my Twitter X thing all the time. And I think, you know, I know Twitter X is, you know, volatile anyway, but still you get the sense this is real for some of these people. Like they just have a visceral kind of hatred for anyone who's homeless, you know, and an inability to kind of process anything about it, you know, that is really scary, because it's a form of violence in itself, let alone the kind of violence they're often justifying. And I didn't see that so commonly some time ago. And so I think that's part of it. They're just wrapping it all together into a sort of, there's hatred throughout our culture right now that's higher than it used to be. And I think it's just, it's making this thing even worse too. But it's not only this. You know, a great example I highlight is the foster care system as well. Like who wouldn't have sympathy for foster children, right? Everybody kind of does, but it's so abusive and so, you know. And yet another study just came out in the province where I come from today on just, oh, a kid died and, oh, we have to redo the whole foster care system. And that's great, they're calling for it, but it's like the 10th study in 20 years saying that, and I haven't seen any changes. So yeah, we can only do what we can to keep, you know, diminishing the hatred in our society as a whole, and then applying it in this kind of circumstance.
They've made it so much easier now. I mean, it should be like a narrow road, like you said earlier, about forcing or any of these you know, psychiatric incarcerations. And what they've done is they've widened the door, they've extended the time, instead of you know, looking like it's any kind of humaneness. But I'm still very alarmed that actually there was over 80% of the people that said that, like 40% of the people said, yes, the people should be forced. And then like 42% said that, well, it just depends. Well, what does it depend on actually?
It depends on whether or not it's them, right? Personally. And then everybody's tune on this changes instantly, pretty much, you know, especially if they're in any way actually forced. Oh, Earl, you're muted.
Sorry, Caroline, I clipped you a little early there. Hunter, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Hey, can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Hey, Rob, it's good to talk to you again, man. I hope you've been well, and I just first wanted to say thank you so much for walking through this presentation. Like Earl mentioned earlier, just reading from the chat, you'd been on the Bipolar Recorder podcast a while ago, and I wanted to ask you about something that you touched on then, and that you touched on again during your presentation, which is simply where are the large mental health advocacy groups like NAMI, like Treatment Advocacy Center, where are these stories when they start entering the dialogue? Because as you know, 988 was just celebrated yesterday. They just had their 2-year anniversary. We start hearing about all these life-saving success stories and stuff, but it seems like through the outreach I've done, the work you've done, we hear many horror stories as well. So I'm just wondering, like, why do you think there's this disparity between like the reality of it versus like what NAMI and other larger groups are necessarily saying.
I think that this is something I think about a lot, and I think that the whole system as it's operates is absolutely dependent on there being no controversy. Like they can't tolerate even an ounce of maybe forced treatment truly is controversial in any sense. Maybe these interventions don't really work for a lot of people. Maybe, right? Like, because it is like a house of cards, and it's not standing on a lot, and so there's a real defensiveness there. So I believe that, like, because I wonder that too about NAMI. I'm like, they know, because that Hannah, I'm going to name her because she's out there promoting 988 all the time. But I saw her talk, and she was with other people, including people of color, who were saying, this is dangerous. This is dangerous. And I think she has a responsibility then to own up to that. Every major media outlet she's talking to, she should be highlighting that. She should say, for example, hey, I'm not a person of color myself, but I've been with a bunch, and they're really worried about the expansion of, you know, the force under 988, you know, and I just want to highlight it, even if I personally don't care. But I think she should care also for everyone who's been subjected to these kinds of involuntary interventions, right? And she knows fully about them. So I want to ask her. I don't know what her reasoning behind this is, but I notice she doesn't do it. She's never bringing it up, even though I was there. I saw a talk where she heard it, and she seemed to sympathize. She seemed to have concern about it. So why don't they? And all these other organizations, right? We know Treatment Advocacy Center is ideological, hard line, right? So they're obviously going in the other direction. But so many other mental health organizations, you know, why are they not just regularly speaking out about it? And it just to acknowledge it's controversial. Some people really don't like it. And I can only think that it's because it's too dangerous even to acknowledge that, because the whole thing starts to fall apart then, right? How can you justify restraining somebody and forcibly injecting them if it's controversial? Right? You can't. Now you have to go, okay, wait a minute. If this is controversial, we need to be a lot more careful in doing this than we currently are. So it's all based on the notion that it's uncontroversial. That's why we can justify it. So, you know, that's just my thinking. And, you know, right now, it's a great question. I think we should continue to explore it more.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. And I just wanted to quickly comment, you know, one of the biggest things we hear people say, like in the most tragic cases where people lose their lives, take their own lives, whatever, you always hear, why did people not reach out for the help? Like there's help available, but then you hear the reality of the help. And I think you encounter a lot of people who have seen that in their real lives, firsthand experience. They go through it once and they realize that these resources are very flawed, and the very, very critical assistance that's needed may not always be there. And I think that's probably the scariest thing. And that's probably one of the key aspects. Just wanted to mention that. But hey, thank you so much again, and thanks for your response. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're right.
Hunter, if you don't mind, maybe sharing the podcast again in the comments for folks who didn't get to see it. Rob and Hunter did a podcast together, which will give you a chance to hear even more in-depth questions and answer from Rob. Nancy, I have you next.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I put some comments in the chat, but I just wanted to say thank you, Rob, for, you know, all this and putting this in the forefront. I'm a veteran, and I was a medic in the Army, and I was a life flight paramedic. About 15 years into my service as a paramedic, I got hurt on the job. I suffered a traumatic brain injury, and I was in a coma for 3 weeks. When I woke up, all my control was taken away because I had no biological family and I didn't have any anybody that I had listed as to take care of if I wasn't able, because at that time, I'm a young buck. I thought I was invincible. I was a veteran and everything. At the time I was young. I didn't think I needed that, but because I didn't think anything was going to happen to me. But nevertheless, so I was put into a state hospital for 17 years because my job, because my job was paying for it.
they said that I had to stay there in that hospital. Well, the state ended up closing them down, and I was miraculously cured and discharged, and I've been on my own since. And then, and I just want to say other times that, I was in a CIT training, and they were talking about, for unhoused people or people with mental illness, calling them those people. And I just raised my hand and I said, I don't really like to, to be called, those people. We're all people. And because of that comment, it got back to my supervisor that I may need hospitalization, because I am diagnosed with a mental illness. And I just want to say another thing. 2 months ago, I had a pacemaker put in. I've been in recovery for a long time. I haven't been hospitalized since I got out of state hospital. I don't even take medication for what I'm diagnosed for. It's on my record though. I got a pacemaker put in 2 months ago. I was waiting for my bed to be assigned. I'm sitting there on oxygen, in a wheelchair. 2 security guards come up to me, put a hand on each shoulder, and I'm looking, it's like, what is this? And the nurse comes up, says, well, you're being admitted. I have to give you a COVID test and I don't want you to hit me because I'm a large person that has schizophrenia as a diagnosis on my record. So like, how do we overcome all this? It's just, it's getting tiresome. I am tired of fighting and, fighting for my, fighting for my care and fighting, that I'm not that person that everybody thinks I am. It's like, I had at one time worked for one of those organizations that's mentioned in the chat, that is supposed to be for, accepts everybody and non-judgmental for mental illness. And they released me because I was a whistleblower, I said things that, was going on that shouldn't be going on for people with mental illness. And, like you said, it's controversial. And, it was against their funders. So, they released me from my job. So how do we, we can't speak up because we're afraid we're going to lose our job. If we got to pay for our housing, we can't lose our job, So we don't have no control over this.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm so sorry you've had to go through that. And yeah, one thing, absolutely, like every study has shown that the most bigoted people against people labeled mental illnesses are healthcare and mental health care professionals, right? Every study that I've ever seen that's looked at that issue has found that, right? So that's what you're getting subjected to, and it's brutal. The thing I think actually Hunter was raising too, and that you've sort of led me to, is thinking about, that's why I think allies are important as well. Like I think people like me and whoever like has not experienced it directly is an important ally to people like you, right? Because in the room, right, if we're speaking then is unified, it's not as easy to dismiss either of us, because people often say to me, oh, you don't know what it's like to have schizophrenia. And then they say to you, oh, you're schizophrenic, you don't know what it's like to be, so if we are speaking together, we're stronger together. And so I really think we need that politically much more than we have. We need definitely, like, the peer voice has to be strong in it, but at the same time, we need allied organizations, different people from all different walks of life and backgrounds, and that collaborating more in political organizations of different kinds. There's so few, there's really almost none in the country, that make anti-force, for example, their issue. Like Wildflower, obviously does a lot of other things, and they make it prominent that they're against force treatment, and that's great. And we need 1 million of those, right? Or at least 1,000, if not 100 or 1,000 of them around the country, where there's funding, hopefully, but people collaborating and just giving voice to this. Because right now, as a journalist, where do I turn? Like, the book was really hard in that way, because normally for any other topic, hey, I want to know who's against logging or who's against, even putting stents in for heart surgery. I can Google that and find an organization or multiple organizations that regularly speak out and, and have this as their position. But it's really hard to find organizations that regularly speak out on forced treatment in particular, and so, yeah, let's get more of them. And I think that's one thing we can do, and figure out how to work together and hopefully maybe fund it too to help it along.
All right, we have one last very brief question. Imade is going to ask, and then we'll say our goodbyes. Sorry, Rob, you also only have time for a limited response.
Okay.
Hello, thank you so much, Rob, for just a really eye-opening book. It really confirmed and validated my experiences as a former psychiatric patient and being in the hospital. So I just want to thank you so much. But yeah, I just want to bring up the fact that I live with borderline personality disorder. There's no medication for that condition. But when I was in a psychiatric hospital, I was forced on antipsychotic drugs. And it was a really traumatic experience. And so because there really isn't any blueprint for borderline, I started getting into like psychedelic treatment, started getting into like myofascial release massage therapy and stuff like that. And, what I've learned is that a lot of these psychiatrists have no idea what our diagnosis is, have no idea what our conditions are, because the DSM is basically based upon subjective observations rooted in white cultural expressions. How white people express symptoms typically is how the DSM is organized. And so I've been listening to Dr. Daniel Amen. He talks a lot about the importance of brain scans, SPECT scans, and in identifying the root causes of mental health challenges. And so I guess my question is like, where should we be going as a society? Where should we be going when it comes to providing alternatives to forced hospitalization?
I think we need to be less reliant on professionals and practitioners overall, as much as we can, come together as communities better, really working on that together. And it's something I do in my volunteer time too, and is working in community development stuff. And I think we could really stand to revitalize that. And I know there are some places where that is happening around North America right now. So that's my short answer to that, is just more mutual aid, more support that includes, people who might be going through emotional difficulties at different times of different types.
Thank you all so much. Well, first, thank you, Rob. Thank you for sharing all your work with us. We'd all be clapping if we were in person. Thank you to all of you for being such a wonderful audience today. I can probably commit to this pretty solidly that this is not the last time we will have a conversation with Rob as a part of our community. So if you didn't get your question answered today, or we end the call and you have a question pop up, don't worry. There will be another opportunity for us to sit together and have this conversation at some point. This has been recorded, so the recording will be available likely on our YouTube within give us a week. It could be sooner than that. And if you have any, I'm going to put Rob's website in the chat one more time. And any last words, Rob?
Oh, just to thank everybody. This discussion has been wonderful. Thank you for sharing what you did and asking the questions you did, because it just helps bring me back to earth too, to feel like I'm part of a community as well. So I hope that I gave that feeling to you, and thank you for helping give that to me.
And we ended on time. What an accomplishment. Everybody have a nice rest of the day.